following is a production of the Dallas Genealogical Society. For more information, please visit our website at www.dallasgenealogy.org. All right, one more time. We'll turn that down. We have audio, we have video. I think we're going to do this. That's it?
Thank you.
All right. Get these out of the way. Well, good evening. Try that again. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Dallas Genealogical Society Technical Special Interest Group. It's Thursday, April 2nd, and this is a live session that we're recording at the Dallas Public Library. And my name is Tony Hansen. And if all my technology will cooperate, we're going to have a presentation. That doesn't want to work, so we'll go to this one. All right, and so we're here tonight to talk about demystifying digital image. I'm going to try my best to talk about it. Demystifying digital images. You know, I'll try to get McAfee to shut up here because it wants to keep jumping up. Okay, and so this is a really interesting topic. If I can get to the right slide, let's try that one. Okay, because there's an awful lot to discuss, and I'm going to try not to bore you or drive you crazy with technical terms, but we are going to cover a lot of material. And we're going to just kind of start out with the basics and discuss what a digital image is, and then we're going to run through kind of everything, how you create them, some ins and outs of what's actually inside the file, information about file formats, information that you're going to want to know about printing them and why that can be challenging, and then some things that you can do to edit them in terms of resizing and some other things like that. So a lot of stuff, but I'm going to try to break it down into real small bite-sized pieces for you so that nobody walks out of here, dizzy or crazier than they already are. Crazier than I am, because this stuff does not want to work for me tonight. Okay, so what is a digital image? It is just a numeric representation of an image. It's a bunch of numbers in a file that somehow magically gets put in there by something, and we'll talk about what that something is, and then taken back out again and shown to you. So it actually is comprised of something called pixels, which is a concatenation for picture elements. And you may also see these, or hear these referred to as dots. So it is just a bunch of dots that are somehow put into a file and pulled back out again when we want to look at them or print them. And so when you view them on a suitable display, or when you print them, this digital image appears to be an exact replica of the thing that you took the picture of or the thing that you scanned when you created this digital image. So nothing magical about it, but there is a lot to it. Now this is, well, it is actually a digital image, but it's actually a mosaic. This is up in a rest area up in the state of Missouri, the one that Kathleen's brother, Mike, was actually the manager of for a while. And it's a large mosaic up on the wall by an artist, or actually two artists, Carl and Sandra Bryant. It's called Prairie Passage. And I chose this because it kind of embodies what a digital image really is. If you think of a mosaic, it's just a bunch of little stuff pieced together to look like an image. Our eyes just look at that and go, oh, that's a pretty picture. But if you zoom in on it a bit, you can see that it's actually a bunch of little pieces of tile. And they're put together in such a way and in such a pattern that we look at that from afar and go, oh, that's really pretty cool. Now, this is in turn a digital image. It's a picture I took of the mosaic using a digital camera. So if we zoom in far enough on that, now you're going to actually see the pixelization, the pixels in the digital image of the mosaic that I took. So those little squares that you see everywhere are actually the pixels that are part of this digital image of this mosaic. And I'll show one more example just because it kind of helps to understand. This is Notre Dame Cathedral up in Montreal. A nice picture I took when we were up there. And if we start zooming in on it, eventually, as we get close enough, you're again going to see this pixelization start to occur. And eventually you start seeing the pixels themselves. So you can see that this picture is actually an organized set of little colors, little square things that, when taken together and when viewed from far enough away, our mind and our eyes go, oh, that's a really pretty picture. But deep down inside, it's actually a bunch of these things that when you zoom in on it, you go, well, no way that's going to be anything that I'd want to look at. But amazingly, it is. Digital images are created a number of ways. One way that you can do it is through what's termed a born digital process. So if you are using some software that will create a digital representation of the image directly, you can just do whatever it is you're doing and then save it in a variety of file formats, which we're going to talk about in a bit. So this is an example of a digital born image. It's probably pretty familiar to you. It's our newsletter. And you know, when a newsletter is created, all the text is put in there, it's arranged, the icons and the table of contents and all that, and ultimately it is saved. So in Microsoft Publisher, which I think is what we're still using to produce it, it directly creates this digital image. This wasn't taken with a digital camera, it wasn't scanned with a scanner. It actually came out of the software as this digital image, you know, looking kind of like a newsletter that we know and we love. There's another type of image that's a graphic image. And this is a special type of image because there's some characteristics that differentiate a graphic image from other types. And one is that there's really not much to it. There's very few colors. Usually it's a pretty small file. And there are actually some file formats specifically suited towards saving images, as we'll see. But that's a graphic image down there. I'll zoom that up a little bit just to kind of show you some of the characteristics. So in a graphic image like this, typically somebody is creating, you know, kind of pixel by pixel, this, you know, iconish kind of thing that they want to create. And typically you use this in software for buttons and things like that. But again, it's not a very big file. It's not very complicated. There's not a lot of different colors. And so those are all kind of characteristics of a graphic image, something that's kind of created specifically for you know, a purpose to be a button or something like that in some software. And that's, I'm not going to talk much about that because they're not really very interesting. So the kind of images that we as genealogists are a lot more interested in are things that we create ourselves. Typically we're going to create them using a scanner, or in the absence of a scanner, using a digital camera. So let's see how those kinds of devices actually go about creating images and interpreting things like colors. Because both of these things use a device known as a charge-coupled device, abbreviated as a CCD, that will actually convert the optics, the image, into something electrical that can be stored in a file and do all these magic things we're talking about. So in a CCD, you focus some light on this device. The device gets hit by the photons, which energizes some semiconductor stuff there, and the CCD will produce some digital information out the back end. Now what it is producing in this case is actually 3 different colors. This is kind of like, you know, when we did finger painting as kids back in kindergarten, where we mix red and green and blue together to make all the different colors. Well, the CCD does the same sort of thing. It looks at the light coming in and it says, okay, I'm going to spit out a representation for the red component, for the blue component, and the green component, and I'm going to save that information, and that's what ultimately gets written into the file and becomes the digital file that we're talking about. So with this, you have what's referred to as a palette of colors. So by combining just these 3 colors, you can make literally, you know, any color in the rainbow. And as we'll see, colors kind of start with black, which is the absence of any light of any color whatsoever, and ranges all the way through white, which is basically full tilt red, green, and blue all mixed together. If you've ever seen a prism, how light comes out and splits off into colors, or a rainbow is an effect of a prismatic kind of thing too. White light is actually comprised of all the colors of the rainbow, and that's just kind of interesting. So, but in a digital file, we have access to all of these colors that you see on this palette here. And by mixing those 3 red and green and blue values, you can create and render any of the colors that you see up there. So that's what's referred to as our color palette that we're working with. And so, for example, if I take this little CCD and I focus a red light on it, then it is going to produce this digital word, this value, 255, and we'll talk about that in a minute, with no green and no blue component. So a pure red light is going to come out here saying the red value is at a maximum because this is pure absolute red light, and that's everything that the CCD is seeing. If I focus green light on it, then the same thing's going to happen with the green word. I'm going to have the maximum value for my green with nothing for my red or my blue, because that's a very pure light on there. It's a magic light. And, not too surprisingly, a blue light does the same thing with the blue component. Now, if it was just 3 colors, life would be really boring, but you can mix them. And so, well, okay, we'll get to mixing. So white light, as I said, is a absolutely maximum brilliance of all colors combined, and that together gives us white. The absence of any light is blackness, and so, you know, if we're trying to render a black color, I'm going to have 0 values for all 3 of my red, green, and blue components. And then you can start mixing all the colors in the rainbow. So if you start playing with the values of the red and the green and the blue, it's a bit like going to the paint store where they take white paint and put in different colors and mix it all up, and you get, hopefully not that color for your living room, but hey, if you like that, that's fine. Everybody's personal taste is fine. But you mix these various components together, store them in these digital words, and when you turn back around and display them again, that's how you get all of these colors that are available to us in this color palette that we have to work with. Gray is kind of an interesting case, and there's some specific advantages that have been taken of gray, because what's unique about gray is that it is an absolutely equal component of red and green and blue, and that there's some advantages that you can take advantage of, and we'll talk about in just a slide or two. So what we're doing, what is going on inside of the cameras and the scanners is they are sensing light, they are converting the light into this numeric representation, and that's part of what is getting saved in the digital image file, pixel by pixel by pixel. And there's about 3 standard ways that you can choose to record the information in a digital file. So you can do it in a color, you can do it in what's called a grayscale, or you can do it in what's termed black and white. And let's take a look at each one of those. So in color, what you're doing is you're basically saving those 3 values we were talking about, the red component, the blue component, and the green component. And initially, to take advantage of basic computer architecture, they said, okay, we're going to give you 8 bits to store the red value, another 8 bits for the blue value, and a further 8 bits for the whatever I've left off, green. So across those 3 primary colors, 8 bits each, so 8, 16, that gives you the 24 bits. And that's referred to as the color depth, because you now have the possibility of having any of those 3 component colors ranging from a 0 all the way up through 255. That's the maximum number you can store in an 8-bit register. Glad you fought through all the traffic there, Gene. Welcome. And so again, with the 3 colors, each color having an 8-bit place to write it, gives you the 24-bit color depth that you'll sometimes see if you're going in selecting values like in your scanner or perhaps even in your camera. And so just to prove I'm a true geek, here's the binary representation. And the way binary works is if there's a 1 in the column, you take the value. If there's a 0, you don't. It's powers of 2. So you start over on the right-hand side of the 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and 128. So if you have all 1s, you're saying I'm going to add all those values up, and if my math is right, when you add all those numbers up there, you get the 255. That's the maximum number that you can fit in an 8-bit register. And I'm going to make this point again, though, so bear in mind, well, we'll come to that in a minute. So if you don't like having that limited number of choices, you can expand your color depth and go with a 48-bit color depth. And with that, you're just now having more bits. So instead of just 8 bits, we're going to use 16 bits for each value. And that gives you a much higher maximum value for each one. It's no longer limited to 255. Now it's 65,000 and some change. And again, because we have 3 values, each with 16 bits, we get 16, 32, that's 48 bits. So it gives you more steps for your colors. But the thing to keep in mind, which is maybe a little mind-blowing at first, and here's the binary value again. We've just extended and added 8 more powers of 8, and that's how you get the maximum value of 65,280, which is, or 535, which is the maximum decimal equivalent for an 8-bit binary number. That's what's going on inside the computer. But it is, when you see those numbers on your color chart, the 255, that's kind of what's reflected on. It's from the maximum value that an 8-bit value would give you. But the thing to keep in mind about this is that on either end of your extreme, whether you're using a 24-bit color depth or a 48-bit color depth, on one end you have black, and on the other end you still have white. That doesn't change. Black is still black, white is still white. But what you do have are a lot more steps in between. Okay, so if I have all zeros, whether I have 16 zeros or 1 0, it's still 0, it's still black. White, whether I have, all the way up to my maximum of 256 or all the way up to my maximum of whatever it is with 48 bits, again, this is still white. You've not altered the basics here, what you have done is you've just said that I'm going to have a lot more steps, a lot more granularity for the colors that I can choose from. And so with a 48-bit color depth, this gets you a little bit closer to what analog film and a camera is capable of doing, which is having a lot of little discrete steps and lots of colors in the images that you're scanning. If you're scanning a document that doesn't have a wide dynamic range, does it make sense to use a 48-bit color depth? Probably not. That might be more for color pictures or if you're doing something real artsy. So anyway, I'm just trying to kind of demystify this 24-bit, 48-bit color depth. Again, it's just a way of representing colors, and the only difference is the number of discrete steps, the shades of colors you have in each of the two steps. And that's all that you're really doing by extending it with more bits. I mentioned grayscale. Okay. All right, so that's the whole point. Blue is still blue, and green is still green, and red is still red. Now, grayscale, remember we said, was equal components always of red and green and blue. And so some smart person said, well, why record the same thing twice or 3 times when I can just simply record it once? And so they came up with a way of coming up with what's termed a grayscale, where they only store the color 1 time, but they use it 3 times. Since it's always the same for the red and the green and the blue, this just gives you a more compact, smaller file at the expense of some colors. You're limited kind of to shades of gray or black and white, but you don't get all those pretty colors. But for certain types of documents or certain types of images, that's just fine. And so it is one way that you can have a digital image where it's not quite as large as having a 24-bit color or a 48-bit color depth. So, while it limits the colors that are available, it still produces a high-quality image that's a lot smaller than a color one. So you don't have that full color palette anymore. You're just dealing, literally with the grades of shade that you see off over there on the right. That's all that you have available in your image. Grayscale, typically you have an 8-bit depth, but you can rank it up to a 16-bit depth. But again, just as with colors, on one end you have black, one end you have white. Whether you have 8 bits or 16 bits, that doesn't change. You just have more granularity with the 16-bit color depth, which the document sometimes justifies. Sometimes it doesn't. You can take it down a step further. I've already said that. We can take it down even further and go with what's known as a black and white image, or sometimes also referred to as line art. And this really takes it down to bare minimal, because what happens in a black and white or a line art image is the scanning device or the camera looks at each pixel and says, it's either black or it's white. There's no in between. Those are your only choices. Now you can change that threshold to say, well, where does white begin or where does N pick up? But it's still, each bit is only black or it is only white. And then those are your only choices. And so you can, as I said, vary the threshold of where white begins or where black begins, but that's about all that you can change with it. Now the advantage of this is that you can, again, have a much more compact, much smaller file, because I'm now not storing colors in 8 or 16 or 24 bits, I'm storing it in one single bit. So if you scan in this mode, you can have a very small, very compact file. Again, at great deal of loss of color. So for some images, for some types of originals, this works just great. For other stuff, it's just horrible, and it's not really an option. But those are kind of the 3 choices we have: color, grayscale, or black and white. Now, why all the fuss? Why did they go through all the trouble of doing this? Well, this chart kind of tries to illustrate that fact. What it's showing you is for some different dots per inch density, starting with 75 dots per inch and going all the way down to 9600. These last 3 columns over here on the right are trying to show you how large the files would be using the line art, the grayscale, and a 24-bit RGB that we talked about. So you can see, let's take the extreme case of down at the bottom there. If I'm scanning something at 9600 dots per inch with a 24-bit color, it's about a 6 gig file. Really huge. Even 8-bit grayscale, it's still about a 2 gig. And with my line art, it's about 276 meg. So you can see that your choice of how you are interpreting your colors, what you're telling the scanner to do or telling the camera to do, can have a huge impact on the size of your file. So that's particularly back in the dark ages when memory was really expensive and computers were unpowerful and stuff. Line art was a really cool thing to use because you didn't have files that were as large. Again, if what you were scanning was suitable for scanning something in a black and white mode. If it's a color picture or something, it just comes out looking awful, and it's not really an option. But I'm showing you this just to kind of emphasize the fact that your choices of what you're choosing for your colors or grayscale or line art and what you're choosing when you set your scan density all have a huge impact on the size of the file that you're creating, and that's why all this stuff was created and why people still pay attention to it. Another thing that is very handy is something that's referred to as a histogram. And this looks very scary and seems very complicated, but it's really pretty simple because all a histogram is a count of each color in the range of possibilities. And so, one of the colors I can have, of course, is black. So at the left end of the scale, in a histogram, I would just show a count of how many pixels there were that were purely black, 0, 0, 0. On the far right hand, I would have a count of everything that is purely white. So it would have the maximum value. In this case, we're doing 8-bit stuff, so 255, 255, 255. Those would be purely white pixels. And then in between, you have stuff ranging like blue and green and red and all of the colors in between. So in a histogram, the software just runs through and it counts up all of a specific color of pixel you have and puts a little vertical bar there showing you how many pixels you have in your image at that color. And when you produce something, it looks a bit like this, which is more of a real-looking histogram from an image. This is of interest particularly to photographers. It's a real good way when you're taking pictures to tell if your picture is properly exposed. If it's overexposed, you're going to see a bunch of pixels over here on the right and not on the left. If it's underexposed, they're going to be back down on the lower scale. It's also very useful when you're scanning, if your scanner software gives the ability to scan something and produce the histogram, because again, you can do some adjustments to make sure that you get the most dynamic range out of your image by playing with what's the black endpoint and what's the white endpoint. So you get a nice high contrast image if you take the trouble to go in, look at the histogram, and make some adjustments and give you just a really good high quality image. So I just mentioned it because it is a really scary term and an ugly looking thing, but it's really not all that mysterious or all that frightening. It's just a count of the number of all of the various colors that you have in your picture, which kind of helps you understand how much contrast you do or don't have in your picture. So you'll bump across that if you start digging into digital files at all. So let's start looking specifically at how a camera works and how a scanner works and how it actually captures these images when we're using those to create stuff. So here's my high-tech camera. The camera has a lens. It focuses the image on the back of the camera. There's typically a shutter which is closed until you want to take the picture. There's an aperture which gauges how much light goes through. And in a digital camera, you have this charge-coupled device back there. And so when you're taking a digital picture, you focus the image on the camera, you snap the shutter, it opens up, the image hits those charge-coupled devices, and a bunch of magic happens. And this is what magic looks like. So this is my high-tech representation for all the pixels that are in the charge-coupled device in the back of the camera. That was a self-portrait, that's me. And so when I open the shutter and the light hits those particular pixels that are underneath where the image is shining, those pixels will record the colors and the intensity of that image. And it happens all at once. So, camera opens maybe, 250th, very quickly, hundredths of a second. And it exposes all the pixels all at once, closes, and you've got your digital image. So some characteristics of a charge-coupled device is how sensitive it is to light, how much light has to actually hit it before it will sense something. Its size, physically, how big it is. How many megapixels it has. I mean, nowadays we talk about megapixels. Back when they started, they were just pixels, but now they're megapixels. And then something known as the aspect ratio, which is just kind of a ratio of the width to the height of the picture. So if it was square, an absolute square, you'd have an aspect ratio of 1 to 1. If it's rectangular, you're going to have like 1.3 or 1.5 to 1. And it's just kind of a measure of how square it is or it isn't. But that has an impact when we start working with these digital images in a bit. iPhone 6 now, it records images in a 3264 by 2448 image. So that's just basically the number of pixels on the horizontal and the vertical scales. So if you do the math and you multiply those out, that's where the 8 megapixels come from. It's the number of individual places where you have the ability to sense light. And then the aspect ratio of this is 1.33 to 1. So that tells me it's about 33% wider than it is tall. And so you'll see anything from a 1 to 1 all the way to about a 1.5 to 1 aspect ratio, pretty common in the digital stuff that we deal with. Okay, so that's kind of all the magic going on in a camera. Scanner's a bit different because unlike a camera, the scanner just has a single row of things that it can use to sense your image. It doesn't have a whole matrix of it, but just has one big long one. And so the sensor has to be moved basically across the face of the image so it can take multiple samples throughout the whole image to be able to recreate the document in total. So this is, again, my high-tech representation for a scanner. The document's laying face down on the glass. Underneath, you've got a light source. There's the charge-coupled device. And then, believe it or not, a bunch of mirrors that take the image and focus it down from the document into the charge-coupled device. And that all sits on a device that physically moves across the document, stopping step by step, scanning all the way across the image, and taking a series of samples of that document, and in the end, recreating whatever it is that you're scanning. So again, if I've got a document such as this, and I scanned it, what you would see, if you looked at it row by row while it's doing it, is each row of things that it senses while it stops and says, okay, I'm going to scan the top of the document, so I see dots there. Then it's going to move down a little bit, it's going to scan it again. It's going to say, well, I see some dots there now. And it just keeps moving, stopping, and sampling until ultimately, when you assemble all the stuff back together, you get something that kind of looks like the original image. So, you know, a scanner is a little more complicated because you've got, you know, mirrors and smoke and things moving, but it does pretty much the same thing. It's just a series of samples of light of images at various points in your document as the scanner head moves across and does its thing. So some terms that you'll hear associated with scanners, there's the optical resolution, and that's just simply how much resolution that whole series of charge-coupled device things has, how many dots per inch that thing is capable of sensing in that long bar that moves across the image. The hardware resolution is the resolution of the thing that steps it across. So again, it's got, you know, a finite, there's the smallest possible step it can take. It can't go any smaller than that, and that represents the hardware resolution. Typically in most scanners now that we use in the home marketplace, the optical resolution and the hardware resolution are the same, but not always the case. You'll see somewhere that does differ. And this is one you want to pay attention to. It's called an interpolated resolution, and this is where the scanner tries to guess what it would see if it had the resolution to see in between the dots that it can see. So they'll take all these dots, and then through some software manipulation, they say, well, you know, I would think kind of based on what I'm seeing here and here, that would probably be something kind of like that. It will fill in some dots and give you kind of its best guess of what is actually in between the dots that it can see. So it's an educated guess. There's a lot of mathematics and a lot of engineering behind it, but that interpreted resolution is still just a guess. It's not based on what it can actually see because that's limited by the optical resolution and the hardware resolution. So you'll frequently see, you know, an optical resolution today now 9,600 dots per inch, both optical and hardware. But you'll see an interpolated resolution of 19,200. It's like, ooh, yeah, that sounds really good. Well, again, it's just software guessing about what it's actually able to see between the optical and hardware resolution. So you want to take that with kind of a grain of salt because it is a guess. That's really, it's an educated guess, but it is just a guess. All right, so that's how we create digital images. How do we save them? Well, we save them in something called a digital file, which has some kind of a format. So the format is what defines the way that the digital information is going to be written into the file and ultimately read from it again. And there's been many, many file formats, digital image file formats created over the years. I went into my ultimate source of stuff, Wikipedia, and on the page that I found there, they had 262 different graphics formats that it knows about, and there's probably more than that as well. So you can see there's been a whole boatload of them created over the years. And they've been created for different reasons and at various stages in technology. So some of the things that you will see as characteristics of a digital file format are things like you see up on the screen, and we'll talk about a few of those and kind of ignore the other ones. So a vector format deals with lines and shapes, and you'll see this typically in an engineering environment, because when you're working with vector stuff, it's really easy to scale it. So if you're in a scientific application or an engineering application, you're working with images, this is where you want to be. For us as genealogists, we don't want to touch that stuff. We don't really play that there because we deal more with something that's known as a raster format, which is kind of what I was showing you with the camera and a scanner. It's just a series of dots in a rectangular organization, and much simpler and much less complicated. So that's one thing that separates a lot of types of file formats from another. If it's dealing with a vector format, it's not the kind of stuff that we're playing with. We're down more in the formats that are dealing with a raster format. The other thing that separates many types of file formats is compression, whether it performs compression or not. Not all formats will do any compression. And compression is just taking that big file and trying to make it smaller somehow. Now how it does it turns out to be very important, because there's a couple of different types of compression we want to be aware of. One is what's referred to as a lossless compression format, and that just means when I take the original file and compress it so it's easier to move around and it doesn't take so much memory, and then I work with that image and view it again, I haven't lost anything. All I've done is just somehow magically made it smaller so that it's easier to store and to manipulate. But this typically results in pretty large files. There is something known as a lossy file format, and this achieves very great file compression. It can make the files very, very small, but it's at a price because you have irreversibly lost some of the information in that file. So, I mean, you think, well, why would I want to do that? Well, you know, again, back in the dark ages when we didn't have a lot of disk space, when we didn't have fiber optic broadband stuff, and we were sending files around, you didn't want to send very large files because you'd spend 15, 20 minutes, you know, waiting for a web page to render. And so having a lossy file format was acceptable because the quality of the images we were working with, the ways that we were using them, that was just fine. Nobody really noticed. So there's a place for both of them in the world. But again, you just want to be sure that you understand in the particular file format that you're choosing what's going on. Is it lossless or is it lossy? Because if it's an image you really care about, you're probably going to want to lean more towards the lossless file formats because they're better for the types of things that we want to preserve as historians and genealogists. Formats also are concerned about the color depth. Again, as a way of trying to achieve small files, many file formats allow you to do tricks with the color depth to make the file smaller. And so that's something else that kind of distinguishes some. Some will also do something called color indexing. You know, rather than having those 65,000 or however many millions of colors in the color palette that we saw earlier, they'll scale it down and say, well, here's 128 colors. You know, the colors that you use have to be in this palette here, and you have to point to which color it is that you want to use. We're not going to give you all those other ones. And that's a way, again, to kind of take this file, and it's a trick to make it small and keep it from getting really large at a loss of some of your color resolution. So it's just one of the characteristics of some types of file formats. So they, as I said, they'll provide some kind of a fixed matrix where you can basically preload the colors in that you're using in your image. Nothing else is possible. It does make for a smaller image for you. And during the encryption, you know, each pixel color is referenced to a color that's in that table. So those are your only choices. That's the only universe that you have available for your colors. Another characteristic, more associated probably with graphic images than other types of things, is something known as transparency. And this is not supported by all file formats. But in transparency, what you're trying to do is you're trying to allow the background to show through this image that you're displaying like on a web page or something. And the way that they do this is they pick a specific color and say, okay, that's my transparency color. So that color in this image is going to get thrown away, and I'm going to replace it with whatever bit is in the image behind it. So those things kind of show through your image by dint of this transparency feature. Like I said, it's really good with graphics images where you've got typically like a solid background color, all of a uniform color. So for things like the DGS logo on the website, transparency is nice because the background colors show through and it just doesn't look like a big square blob anymore. Do you want to do that with a picture of your grandmother? Probably not. So transparency is something that you use selectively, and you don't necessarily need to have it in every case. But again, with a transparent image, when it's displayed, the background is allowed to kind of show through. Very nice for colors and things like that for graphic images. And then metadata. We've talked a lot about metadata in this forum. Metadata is just information about the image, and it is embedded into the file and rides along with the file wherever it goes. But not all file formats support metadata. So if metadata is important to you, you'd want to make sure that you select a file format that you're working with that allows you to associate metadata with it. There's a number of components of metadata that are associated with images. EXIF is photographic information. So when you take a picture with your iPhone or with a modern digital camera now, it will record things about the lens, the type of camera, your aperture setting, your shutter speed. All that stuff gets associated with the EXIF metadata part of the file. The International Press Telecommunications Council is more stuff that we're interested in, things like locations, dates, names, places, stuff like that. And XMP is just an ISO standard that does similar types of stuff. So those are just some standard that you're going to see if you start looking into and reading about metadata a bit. So those I just mentioned as a way of understanding why there's 250 some odd file formats. There's a lot of things that go into creating a file format that you use to store digital images. And so they've just been created over the past, 20 years as technology has advanced, as technology has changed. These are some of the things that are being manipulated, and it's just why there are so many file formats available today. But there's a few favorites that everybody knows and loves. So TIFF is the tag image file format. This one's been around for quite a while. It has no inherent data compression. It can be compressed using third-party software, but there's nothing built into the standard that will compress it for you. It supports a number of choices for your color depth. It does allow, but not demand, color indexing. You can do transparency, and it does support metadata. And today it's probably the premier file format in use for images that you don't want to have degraded through the use of some kind of a lossy file format. So if you're an institution, if you're a researcher, if you're a library or government institution, for those types of images, TIFF is probably going to be your go-to format. JPEG is very popular. It was developed for the internet, and because of the characteristics that it has, it's got great compression, and I'll show you some numbers here in the next slide. Some variability in the color depth, doesn't support color indexing or transparency, does support metadata. So there is a place for JPEG, but again, you just have to understand the limitations of what you're doing. Here's the advantages of it. If I start with an original TIFF file, scan it, I think this is an 8.5 by 11 document at 600 dots per inch. I'm going to have about a 25 megabit file when I'm done saving it. Same file in JPEG, which has varying types of compression that you can choose. So using kind of the least amount of compression, what they call a JPEG large format, still knocks about 10 megabytes off the size of my file. It's still a 600 dot per inch file, but they've done some magic in there to make the file size quite a bit smaller. Not small enough for you? Well, then go for a medium format. You can get it down to about 3 megabytes. Now, if that ain't good enough for you, take it all the way down to a small format and get it down to 1.5. Now, what's the magic here? How is that happening? What are you losing by doing these smaller, more compressed file formats? Well, what you do is you lose a bit of your color and correct intensity and resolution. And so this is a much magnified, very small file that was saved in a small JPEG format. And you can start seeing these squares here. These are what JPEG is doing and how JPEG is making your file small. So instead of having 30 or 40 or 50 pixels defined here, it just basically says, well, you know what? All these colors here are pretty similar to each other, so I'm just going to save that color once with a little bit of algorithm. When I display the image again, I'm just going to use the same color in all those cells. And so it's close enough. Doesn't look too bad, and if you zoom in on it, it looks pretty horrible. But if you're taking a picture of somebody's dog, or boats at the lake or whatever, these are great, especially if you're emailing them, putting them on your website. Who's going to notice? Because who's going to zoom in on an image this close? So, for those types of images, for things that you don't really care if you have this kind of what's called a JPEG artifact in there, great. use JPEG, compress it, don't send huge files. But again, if these are images that we've just taken, with our camera in Norway, and we're never going to get back there again, I don't want this kind of distortion in my images. So, my only point about JPEG is it's the right tool for the right place. Can be a pretty bad choice if you're trying to work with images that you really truly care about. Another one that was popular for a while was GIF, graphics interchange format. And this one had some compression, varying degrees of color depth, indexing, transparency, supports metadata. It was really a pretty good protocol, except for the fact that the compression algorithm that was used in it got tied up in some litigation. There were some people that claimed that they had rights over this thing, and they had no right. The people that created GIF had no right to use it, and so it got entangled in all this legal brouhaha, and it really kind of fell out of favor in a hurry. Large corporations that didn't want to get the snot suit out of them just said, no, we're not going to use that. So it kind of came and went. It's still a pretty good format, but it's kind of lost a lot of its luster. Ping is another one that is one that is actually a pretty nice one. It is a lossless compression. It has lots of options for the color depth, does color indexing, and supports transparency and metadata. It is a much better choice than JPEG, and some consider it to be almost as good as TIFF even. So the World Wide Web Consortium has endorsed this as a replacement for GIF, and so I'm starting to lean towards, if I'm not using TIFF, Ping is my format of choice because it seems to have a lot going for it. And then last but not least, there's a new kid on the block, JPEG 2000. Now this is not JPEG, it is totally new. And it is a reworked image to try to address some of the shortcomings of TIFF. And in particular, you notice that it has both lossless and lossy compression built right into the file format. And so this is something that you're going to start seeing used more. It's already being used in the university level. Institutions, governments are starting to adopt this. In the consumer space, you're not going to see JPEG 2000 on lower end scanners or even on cameras or things like that, but it's coming, and its day will emerge, and it will slowly take over TIFF, I think. But it's a pretty good format. It's just not really widely popular in the space that we play in right now. So those are just kind of an overview of some of the formats and some of the characteristics and what you might want to know when you're trying to decide what's the most appropriate format for saving a file. Again, we mentioned metadata. Metadata is just information about the image. So this is kind of a pre-digital metadata, information that was printed on the picture back when it was taken. It gave you the month and the year that it was produced, and if you're really lucky, somebody wrote some names on there for you. In digital metadata, the information is actually embedded in the file. And so if you could look at the file, you would see all of the pixel information is there. And then associated with it, you would see, for example, the EXIF data, if this is something that you took with the camera, and then even the metadata, if you associated things like where the location was, who's in the picture, the date it was taken, who was the photographer, yada, yada, yada. All of that stuff has a place in the file, and it stays with the file then, for the most part, wherever the file goes, unless something strips it out or ignores it. The International Press Telecommunications Council is probably the most widely supported metadata standard in use. It was developed by the newspaper companies when they used to have wire services and were shipping images around the world. They used to send along with it information about the image, and that has evolved and morphed into the metadata standard that is most supported and most widely used in most metadata standards today. Again, some file formats support metadata, so TIFF, JPEG, and Ping do, and some don't. So if you're working with a BMP or a GIF, you're not going to be able to write metadata because there's nothing defined in the format that allows you to put it there. So these are not really wildly popular images anymore. I just mention it because when I was starting to work with metadata, I had a bunch of images that my package loaded for me, and I was trying to do some global bulk saving of some stuff, and it wouldn't save for me. It drove me nuts. And it's because I had a couple of these things in there, and the software sensed it and said, no, I can't write to everything, so I'm not going to write to anything. So just, you'll probably bump into that if you work with metadata enough to. I probably will again and forget what the problem was and spend another day trying to figure that out. But not all formats support metadata. That's the message here. So we've gone through all the trouble of creating an image. What good is it if we don't look at it, right? We want to view them, we want to print them. And so once you have the file recorded, or the image recorded in a file, you've got to have some software that knows how to interpret it, how to get it back out of the image, and lets you do things with it. So, given the appropriate software that understands your format, it's going to pull all that data out and let you do something with it. Now, what that something is can have a huge impact on how it appears. Looking at a digital image on a computer screen is a much, much different thing from printing it. And we'll dive into why that's true and how that impacts what happens to images. So we'll start by the question everybody wants to know, how big is that image? Well, digital images have no true size. They're dimensionless. But there are things about the image that is really going to influence how it looks when you try to print it or display it on a screen, and particularly when you try to enlarge it. And you'll understand this, well, you'll at least be exposed to it in more detail than you probably want to know in just a few minutes. So we'll start with a little stamp. This is one that I got from some Catholic icon from my grandparents. It's a little stamp. It's a 1 by an inch by an 1 1/4 stamp. And I like to use it as an example because it really shows off this size stuff. So what I did was I took it and I scanned it. And I scanned it using a 300 dot per inch setting. So I've got an image now that's 300 by 375 dots because it's a very small image. And when I take that image and display it on my screen at its highest resolution, which is 1,920 pixels this way by 1080 that way, I get an image that occupies kind of a small amount of my screen. But I don't know if you've ever done this, but in Windows you can go and you can change the resolution of your screen. And when I do that, when I make it a lower resolution setting, watch what happens to the size of this image. Okay, so now this is, I'm saying to my computer, effectively my screen, I want you to use fewer pixels to display this image, but it's still the same image, it just got bigger. And if I go in and set my screen to an even lower resolution, it just keeps getting bigger. This thing's going to take over the world pretty soon. So now what's going on here? Well, what's going on is that the image is the image is the image. It's 300 dots by 375 dots. And as I keep making the resolution on my screen smaller, there's fewer screens or fewer dots available on the screen to display it, the image is actually getting larger and larger. The dots are getting spread out more and more just by varying the settings on my monitor. And I do this just to illustrate that, again, a digital image truly it has no size. It is just purely going to be appear the size that it does depending on the characteristics of the monitor, and as we'll see, depending on the characteristics of the printer. This is a really hard concept, but it's really a simple concept. And I'm going to hammer on that just a little bit. Focusing first though on printer, or on monitors, there's some other characteristics besides how big it's going to appear that impact how digital images are going to be displayed. When you look at the pixel on a screen, it's pretty neat because it has the ability to display just about any color. So any color in my palette, when I'm displaying an image, that's going to pretty much represent that color pretty truly. But a printer can't do that. As you'll see, printers are really pretty stupid when it comes to colors and things like that. So right away, when you look at an image on a monitor, it's going to look a lot different than if you take that image and print it on your printer. And it's just because there's a very inherent fundamental difference the way that printers reproduce images from the way that monitors reproduce images. So that's a difference right there. So let's focus in on printers. So the printers that we have available to us at home generally can do one thing and one thing very well. They print dots. And if it's a black and white printer, it can print a black dot or a white dot, which I'll let you in a secret, it doesn't actually print a white dot, it just prints nothing. So really all a printer can do is print black dots. And that's all it can do. So when you've got this image that's got 24 bits of color depth or 48 bits of color depth, and I've got a printer that can print black or white, I got kind of a problem here, don't I, if I'm a printer. Very hard to render an image with black or white, but they do it. But it's just, it's kind of interesting how they go about doing it. All right, so one way that you can do it is through something known as line art, or another way, something through shades of gray. So in line art, it is just kind of a dot-by-dot representation of the letters that I'm printing. And so if you would take that line of output from a printer and scan it and zoom it in, as I've done there, you see it's a pretty high resolution, letters, and it looks pretty much like you would expect. Kind of like in this sense, it's a lot more like a computer screen. And you can get away with that with text and with certain primitive line art because it's pretty predictable and pretty easy to reproduce an image when you have simple stuff. When you have images, though, life isn't so simple. So now here's something that I printed and scanned in again. This is obviously an image type thing. And if we look down in the corner over there and zoom way in on that, you'll see what the printer is actually doing. It's making maximum effective use of the ability to print dots. And where it wants something dark, it prints a lot of dots close together. And where it wants something white, it prints a whole lot fewer dots and lets the white in the paper show through. And that's how printers, particularly black and white printers, do images. It's by basically carving the image up into sets of areas and using variations of dots or no dots to recreate the image for you. And so, for example, it can take the grid size was the term I was searching for. So you can take a 6x6 grid size, and that grid is kind of a shade. It's part of your image. And with 6x6, you've got 37 possible shades of gray that you can represent in that area of the image. So not a lot of resolution. So if you want more resolution, the only choice you have is to have a bigger grid. So I can go to a 7x7 grid. Now I've got 50 shades of gray that I can represent there. But I've really reduced my resolution a bit more. It's not a factor of 6 anymore, it's a factor of 7. You want more resolution? More dots. So you can go all the way up to a 10x10. So I've got lots of shades of gray there, but you can see that I've really dumbed down the resolution that I can show, because I now have a grid of 10x10 dots, where before I had 6x6. So the more shades of gray you want to have, the more resolution you want to have in producing this picture, the more resolution you kind of lose. So when you look at a printer, and we'll talk about this in a minute, printers will often talk about how many dots per inch they can print. Absolutely accurate, but very misleading, because it's not the same thing as pixels in an image, because they have to have a lot more dots in a small area to reproduce the image. Sometimes 100 dots to represent 1 pixel. So that's the big difference between computer screens and printers. It gets even more convoluted if you have color images, because again, printers do what really well? They print dots. Well, now you can print colored dots. Whoop, right? Well, to print colors, what you have to do is group different colored dots together, which again, the way that the human eye works, when you get far enough away from it, they all kind of tend to blend together and give you the color that the printer is trying to give you. But again, printers only have a limited number of colors to work with. Some have 4, some have 6. But still, they're printing dots. It's just different colors of dots. And so what the printer does is it prints different colors very closely together, and we perceive this as different colors. This is a process known as dithering. Not what I'm standing up here when I can't remember what I'm trying to say, but dithering in the sense of the color. So when you're printing in color, it's actually putting lots of colored dots around to produce all the many various colors that we want to have in our color pictures. And so if you take a color image, well, okay, and this gets back to the resolution. I can have a printer that has a resolution of 1200 dots per inch, but because of the need to print so many dots to represent a pixel, it can actually only print an image resolution of about 250 dots per inch. It takes a lot of dots to represent a pixel from my image. It takes a lot more in a color than it does in a black and white. So if you take a look at something that you print in color and you zoom way in on it, you start seeing all these different colors there. And you can see, that zone where the blue and the green kind of cross over, when you zoom in on it, it doesn't look like much, but you can see that the printer is having to do a lot of dots grouped together to try to represent, these different colors and how they overshadow each other. So when you're looking at a printer, they're accurate, they're real, they're specific, but the dots per inch that the printer says it can do shouldn't be confused with image resolution. That's just how close the printer can spray its black and white or colored dots around. It doesn't necessarily translate into the resolution of the image when it finally gets rendered on the page. So just for some rules of thumb from what I've been reading, if you're printing something, you of course want to send a very high quality image to your printer, but for the most part, and again, this is just kind of a general rule for home printing type stuff, sending an image resolution greater than about 300 dots per inch to the printer is really kind of overkill. It just makes a bigger file, it's going to slow things down, and it may actually even reduce the image quality by sending like a 9600 or 1200 or higher resolution to the printer, because most of the pixels are just going to get thrown away anyhow. So let's see some practical examples of how you may need to take this into account if you're trying to print something. And let's go back to my favorite little stamp again. So this is the stamp that we scanned at 300 dots per inch. Now I'm going to print it. And if I want to print it at its original size, 1 by 1 1/4, we're good. 300 dots per inch is not overkill. I'm going to get pretty good resolution, so not a problem. Life is good if I can print it, at the size that it actually physically exists at. How about if I want to print it twice as large? Okay, same image, still 300 dots per inch, but now I'm doubling the size of it on the printed page. Well, I'm now effectively cutting down my resolution. I don't have 300 dots per inch anymore because I've made it twice as big. So I now have 150 dots per inch because the image is twice the size as what I scanned it at. Because I'm just saying to the printer, I'd like you to enlarge it, make it a bit bigger. But that's still pretty good because 150 dots per inch effective resolution on my printer still ought to give me a pretty good resolution, not a problem. But if I want to go any larger than that, if I want to take the stamp and I want to print it 8.5 by 11, and I still keep it at that 300 dots per inch, it's going to start looking pretty fuzzy because I'm running out of bits. I'm spreading them further and further apart to enlarge this thing on the printer. I'm going to start running into problems. So if I did want to take this little thing and print it much larger than it actually is, the best thing I could do is go back and scan it at a much higher density, maybe 1200 dots per inch or something, because by the time I take it and blow it up on the printer, I'm going to spread those 1200 dots per inch back out to 300 or 150 dots per inch because I'm doing it over the whole page because I'm printing it very big. So that's where it's helpful to understand the bit density of your image and understand what's going on in the printer. It gets a little confusing because it involves math, but if you just kind of stop and logic it out, if I've got so many dots per inch and I want to have a bunch of inches, I need more dots per inch if I want it to look like something when I end up printing it. And we'll come back to that. I'll show you a couple more examples that might make that clearer. Now we can do some things to resize the image, kind of. And scaling is what we've just been talking about. You can also crop it and then you can resize it. Now scaling it's kind of, it's just specifying a dot per inch value that you want to use when you print it. It's just a numeric value that's saved with the image. It doesn't really do anything to save the image. But essentially what you're saying is when I print this thing, I want it to be a 4 by 5 image or an 8 by 10 image or a 1 by 2 image or something like that. Just simply telling the printer physically how big you want it to be on the page. It has nothing to do with the dots per inch or any of that stuff. It's just simply a number that may be associated with the file and that may or may not be utilized by the application when it actually prints it. So when you talk about scaling an image, it's just a number that says how big I want it to be when I print it. So that's a very simple concept. And in Photoshop 12, and that's something you can do at the time you scan it, or you can do it later. In Photoshop 12, I think I've got, okay, there we go. I can scale it and say what I want the width and the height to be, and it will make the resolution scale accordingly. So if I'm making it bigger, it's going to spread the dots out. If I'm making it smaller, it's going to scrunch the dots together. But all I'm really saying is when you print it, this is the size that I want it to be. But I'm not really fundamentally changing the original image whatsoever. And it's because I'm not doing something called resampling. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Cropping, you've all done that. That's just where you go into an image and you select part of it. So again, using our newsletter as an example, if you wanted to crop out John Coletta's head, you could just go and select it, take that picture, that piece of the image, and save it as a separate file. Now, if this file was scanned at 300 dots per inch, how many dots per inch is the piece that I've cropped out there? Take a wild guess. 300. I haven't changed anything. I've just selected a portion of it. It's just a smaller piece of it. But again, I'm just selecting a piece of something that was scanned at 300 dots per inch. It's still 300 dots per inch. Now, if I want to make the newsletter image 8.5 by 11, it's probably going to look pretty good. If I want to take this little cropped out piece here now and make it 8.5 by 11, do you think it's going to start looking like he's got a beard or real fuzzy or something? Yeah, because I've taken a little tiny piece of it. I don't have that many pixels in that small component. If I start making it too big, it's going to start getting fuzzy on me again. But cropping is just simply taking a piece of a document. You don't change anything to do with the underlying characteristics of the dots per inch. Now, resizing will actually alter the dots per inch. So in resizing, what you're doing is changing the image, and you're changing the bit density of it. Typically, it's best to make it a lower density, because if you try to increase the density, there's nothing magic here. You can't just produce pixels you don't have before. The software will let you resize it at a higher density, but it's just going to be guessing at what the intervening pixels should be. So resizing to something at a higher density is a bad idea, but frequently you'll take something at a very high density and resize it to a lower density, and that makes a lot of sense. The way you do it is in the software. So again, in Photoshop 12, I can go in and say that I want to take this thing, and I want to resample it, and I want to change essentially the size of it or the dots per inch. And the software will go through and will just kind of run through across all of the pixels and select the appropriate ones and give me a lower density image. So if I've got something that I've scanned at a real high resolution, maybe a 9600 dots per inch or something, and I want to print it, I might make a copy of it, resample it down to like 300 dots per inch, and that's a file that I'll send to the printer, or that I'll use on the internet, or I'll mail to my mother, or something like that. So you're essentially taking a high resolution image and making it a lower resolution, hopefully copy of it. Don't work with the master and do that, because you might be upset. So in resizing, you're actually changing the inherent resolution of the image. So those are three things you typically do: cropping and resizing. There's some other stuff that you can do. More common stuff. You can change the orientation from portrait to landscape. You can change the contrast of it. You can do color correction. You can play with the color balance. You can change file formats. I can take a TIFF and render it as a JPEG. I can take a JPEG back to a TIFF. I can't undo, the bad things that JPEG did when it threw away all the information, but I can change the format if I want to. Nothing to stop me from doing it. And you can change a whole bunch more. And the person to talk to about how to edit pictures, which is really what we're talking about here, is Sandra Crowley. I don't know if you've ever seen her presentation that she did about editing images and the things you can do with it, but it's excellent. She's a magician at Photoshop, and maybe we can talk her into coming back. And she talked several years ago at the TechSig, and it was really informative, so maybe we can talk her into it again. And again, just because I'm an engineer, I want to come back to this size and resolution stuff, just to kind of drive the point home. So here's the homework assignment, but I'll show my work. So let's assume I want to digitize a letter. It's an 8.5 by 11, and I want to use my camera, and I want to take the best quality picture I can with my camera. And then I also want to do the same thing with my flatbed scanner at a slightly better resolution. So, what does that mean? So with the camera, you don't really think about resolution for a camera, but you can if you just think like an engineer for a minute, and that's what I'm going to do for you. So again, my camera has a maximum number of pixels on one. I've got 232 64 pixels one way and 24 48. Now I've also got this aspect ratio that I was talking about. The size of the thing, the shape of it can't distort much. And 8.5 by 11, if I maximize it over that CCD in my camera, I can go the full width here, but I'm going to have a space on the bottom there where I kind of run out of image. Now if I make it big enough so that I use that stuff on the bottom, I'm going to be cutting off parts of the side of the document. Okay, so if I take it and just maximize it in the one dimension and live with a little bit of loss down there, and so basically this is just taking my camera and just going up and down until I've got full width of the document in there, and having a little bit off the bottom that I'm just going to throw some pixels away. That's the maximum resolution I could get out of my digital camera taking a picture of an 8.5 by 11 document. So if you start doing some math, which, as I say, being an engineer, I love to do, we know we've got 2,448 pixels on the side. I'm leaving off 96 pixels on the vertical side because my image isn't big enough to fill that particular shape. And if you do the math, you can start seeing that I'm throwing away about 2.5% of my pixels, but I don't care. But I also now can figure out what's the resolution that I've got using my camera to take this picture. And it's really kind of interesting. So if you take that 8.5-inch dimension where I've got 2,448 pixels to work with, and you do the math, my camera is capturing that letter, that 8.5 by 11 document, at a resolution of 288 pixels per inch, or dots per inch. So for using my camera to take a picture of an 8.5 by 11 document in that orientation, that's the most resolution I can squeeze out of my camera. And I could get less, certainly, but that's the maximum that I could do. Which I just found that kind of interesting. I never really thought about my camera having kind of a dots per inch resolution, but if you know the size of the document, or the thing that you're shooting, and how much of your pixels that you're using, the math is really pretty straightforward. So that's the best I could do with the camera. If I wanted to improve on that with my scanner, I just would have to do it at 300 dots per inch, and my scanner would do probably a slightly better job of the document than my camera will. So I found the exercise kind of interesting to at least understand that a camera can have a resolution, a dots per inch setting or a dots per inch value for the document that I'm trying to capture with it. Take another example just to blow everybody's minds. So now I've got a slide. And for my purposes, this probably isn't quite accurate, but let's just pretend the slide's really 1 inch by 1.5 inches. And I want to scan it, and I want to print it. I want to create a 4:6 image. So what scanner setting should I use when I scan the slide if I want to print something at a 4:6, knowing that I want to end up having enough pixels that it doesn't look fuzzy? So that's really the question. If I want to print it at a 4:6 image and I want to scan it, what's the dot per inch setting that I need to use to ensure that I've got an adequate number of pixels when I print it? Nice real world problem, actually. All right, so I want a 4:6 image. I want 300 dots per inch effective when I send it to the printer. So it turns out the 4:6 format is exactly 4 times the size of the slide. The aspect ratio is identical. So I just know that it's going to be 4 times as large in all dimensions. So 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 1.5 is 6. Aspect ratio is identical, so that's good. Since I'm enlarging it 4 times, and I want to have 300 dots per inch when I enlarge it, then it's just simply a matter of math. So if I want to have 300 dots per inch when I print it, I've got to scan it at some higher value. And as it turns out, I've got to scan it at about 4 times higher value in order, when I take that little thing and blow it up 4 times, to have my 300 dots per inch again. So the answer to this is, if I scan it at 1,200 dots per inch, and then I print it at 4 times its actual size, I'm going to end up printing with an effective 300 dots per inch, and I'll have a nice high-resolution picture, 4:6, of this little 1 by 1.25 or 1.5 inch image. Does it start to make a little bit of sense? You may not be able to do some of you know can do the math. What about if I want to make it even bigger? What if I wanted an 8? Well, then that just kind of shows, a little 1 by 1.5 inch size blowing up. So I'll have 1,800 pixels the long way, which boils down to about 300 dots per inch effective. I'll have 1,200 pixels this way, spread out over 4 inches. There's my effective 300 dots per inch again. What if I wanted it even bigger? What if I want to go at 8 by 10? Well, 6 by 10 isn't quite big enough. These are going to quite work. I could go to 8 by 12, but I don't really have that much image left. If I take my slide, I'm going to have 8 inches on one end. I'm only going to have 10 inches on the other side. I'm going to have to, I'm going to have 12 inches, and I've only got an 8 by 10 format that I'm trying to print at. So the only way, this just doesn't fit because the aspect ratio is kind of messing with me here. So if I wanted to have an 8 by 10 image, I'd have to kind of increase it to an 8 by 12 and then cut off an inch on either side. So I'd have to crop it to take this slide and make it big enough so it fully fill the 8 inches and fully fill the 12 inches, or fully fill the 10 inches. I'd have to throw away a bit of the stuff on the side. Let's assume for a second that this picture was such that the stuff on either side was fine. I can do the cropping. I go ahead and do that. So we're going to try to effectively blow this thing up even further. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So we still want to have this effective density of 300 dots per inch. I'm now enlarging it by a factor of 8. So now I'd have to scan this little slide at 2400 dots per inch, which, you know, scanner will do just fine, so that when I enlarge it and throw away some of the stuff on the other side, I've got this 8 by 10, but still a nice high resolution representation of that tiny little slide. So, you know, all of this is just kind of by way of impress you with my math skills, of course, but also to show you that, you know, while digital images don't have size, what you intend to do with it, how big you intend to blow it up, does determine, you know, have some impact on what you need to do when you're creating the digital image. If you're going to make it really big, you'd better have a lot of pixels when you scan it. If you're not going to be making it big, then you can make it a bit smaller and keep the file size down there. So hopefully you just kind of walk away with an appreciation of that. You may not be able to do the math, may not care to do the math. I certainly understand that. But if I've just kind of impressed on you the fact that, you know, digital images truly are dimensionless until you start actually doing stuff with them, then I've done my job. We're done. I've got some really good references I want to leave you with. This is a website by a guy named Wayne Fulton, and it is an incredible collection of information about digital images, scanning, and photography, and anything you would ever want to know about a digital image, it's there. And so it is probably just a really good reference if you want to start digging into any of the things that we've talked about and understand them in a little more depth. I made great use out of that. These are some of the things that he has available to them. That's actually what it looks like. In my PowerPoint presentation, I've reproduced the links, so those are clickable links. If you just want to go to my PowerPoint presentation and click any of those, you'll go right to his website. Wikipedia has some pretty good information, tell you all about more than you want to know about 256 different graphic formats. And this one too, this Epson technical brief gave a lot of information about scanners and some of the parameters and things about measuring, and was just a real good reference there. So with that, I promise no more math, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions that you might have. Barbara.
Okay, with the Nikon camera, there are two different kinds of lenses, and they, what the D format is F, and you get more of an, I understand you get more of an image with an F than with a D. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but also it's a more expensive lens.
Okay.
So I think you get a bigger aspect ratio with an F lens. Do you have the same thing with the Canon, or?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you think about, let's take a wide-angle lens for a second, where you're, you know, if I was standing here right now and I had a wide-angle lens, you know, I'd get the door over there and the monitor over here and everything in between. And so I'm basically bringing a lot of light information in and focusing it in on my charge-coupled device at the back of the camera. Okay. Now let's go to the other end of the extreme. I've got a telephoto lens. So now I'm going to zoom in, you know, right on the nose in your face, and I'm getting just that much. Now I'm still focusing that on my charge-coupled device, but I'm getting a lot less light energy because I've got such a small part of what I'm trying to bring into the camera anymore. So those are kind of two polar extremes to how your lens, that you know, on many cameras that you can change, impacts basically what you're bringing into and focusing on your picture. And so the aspect ratio, you know, how wide and how big it focuses is of course going to be different on different lenses, and the amount of light energy that you bring in is going to get impacted by that as well. I'm not sure what your question was, and so I'm not sure I'm answering it. Am I close?
There are two different lens formats on Nikons, and one of them, and cameras. And so if you have an FTX 300 or whatever Nikon, and you put a D lens on it, then you don't get the full advantage of the F, of how wide you can get with the format of that camera.
And I wonder if that's because where the lens is focusing the image doesn't exactly match the size and the shape of your charge-coupled device on the back of the camera. Yeah, so you might have, in one case, you'd have a lot more charge-coupled device and you're focusing it on a narrow part of it, so you're not taking full advantage of the electronics in the camera. Or you might have more image than you've got charge-coupled device, in which case what you see in the lens isn't what's going to get recorded by the charge-coupled device. I'm guessing, but both those seem like kind of logical things. So you'd want to use the right series of lens with your camera to make sure that the two are aligning with each other.
I know that the F-series ones are 3 times the cost of the D series ones too. The other thing is, I know when I take my images to someplace that can print it, they'll print a full image in 8x12. It's just hard to buy 8x12 frames anywhere. Don't seem to make the 8x12 frames.
Well, and I think that's because they're preserving the aspect ratio,
Yeah, right.
and giving you, your whole picture. And you're right, it's everything that you recorded in your camera, but it doesn't necessarily fit in the old camera format frames.
Right, yeah, I mean, it's just, everybody wants 8x10s or whatever the standard formats have been. So when you buy frames, every once in a while you can find the 8x12, and they call them digital frames.
Yeah.
For printing digital, for displaying digital photographs.
And how big your images get when they're blown up depends on your original aspect ratio of the device itself. Different cameras have different aspect ratios, so when you do the math, so you have an 8x12, you could cut that down to 10 inches, but then you wouldn't have the full 8 inches, so you'd have something less than 8 inches too, but you'd have, you'd have it squeezed in. So that's where the aspect ratio starts getting squirrely on you when you're trying to enlarge these things.
Well, the other thing is you can get the full width, but you'll have to crop off some of the image.
Yeah.
To fit the 8x10.
Yeah, with film cameras, you didn't have that problem. You had whatever it gave you, and they were pretty standard. Yes, Carolyn?
I think I understand scanning and saving as a TIFF and a JPEG more than I understand taking a photograph. If I took a photograph with my iPhone, I mean, what is it saved as? Is it saved as a JPEG? Is it saved as a TIFF? Is it none? And only when I open it in something like iPhoto and mess with it, I'm confused about cameras.
Okay, well, I believe that even the iPhone saves it as a JPEG image.
Okay.
And my Canon certainly does that by default as well. It's pretty popular.
You can't change it to a TIFF.
Only
if you...
It depends on your camera. So my Canon SLR lets me save it in...
I don't have a fancy camera.
But it does let me save it in something called a RAW format, which is a variant of TIFF.
Oh,
okay.
RAW is I understand RAW.
Yeah.
I don't have, my camera doesn't, but a friend of mine does, and he's always telling me, if you use my camera, take RAW images.
Right. And the only problem, and it's not much of a problem, but you have to have software then that understands your camera's RAW format, so you can then bring it in, and then you can save that as a TIFF or as a JPEG or a PNG or whatever you want it to.
Okay. That clarifies.
Susan.
All right. We're talking about resizing an image. Say I scanned a small little school photograph of my cousin. I no longer have it, but I would like to make that a larger picture. I understand there's software using fractals that will make it resized. Did you come across any of that?
No, I did not.
Okay.
Tell me more.
It's On One is the name of the software, and I've not used it yet, but I didn't know how effective software manipulation of image size is. And again, it's using fractals to guess what, I guess there's so many black and white, and it just makes it bigger. But you could use...
You get more apparent resolution?
Well, right. And what it does is it allows you to increase the size, go from a 2-inch by 1-inch school picture and make it 4 by 6 or 5 by 7.
I mean, but you can do that with Word, but it's...
But if you scanned it at lower resolution, I know that if I had the image and I scanned it at a higher resolution, then I can make it larger.
Right.
But if I can no longer scan the image at a higher resolution, does the software...
You're not going to get anything no matter what the people say.
There's nothing in it. There's nothing.
You don't have the resolution there, you're not going to get anything out of there.
Well, but I'm intrigued by the idea of how they're doing it using fractals, because it is kind of it's a new technique for dealing with images. There may be a little bit again, like you, Dean. I'm a little pessimistic that it can look pretty fuzzy when it gets big, but
They got to get data from someplace.
Well, and it's I mean, the software is certainly taking data there and saying, this is what it should look like if I increase it to.
Well, it's like interpolation.
Right,
Yeah.
that's right.
It's
So I
probably
haven't used it, and I just wondered if.
No, I
that was-
had not even heard of that. I mean, I've heard of fractal cameras, but I hadn't heard about the software that was dealing with it.
Okay, well, I'll try to find out.
Yeah, I'd be curious.
Let us know about it, that's
Okay.
interesting.
Get it and play with it and see if it works.
Come back and tell us.
Freeze it up and let you have a trial there.
Yeah, right. Well, most
So that-
software does let you do trials, but, all right. I just wondered if you'd come across it. Okay. All right.
Carolyn, you're waving your arm there. Did you have another question?
Well, yes, way back at the beginning, you were talking about color, grayscale, and black and white. When you're scanning a newspaper article, would it be best to scan it as black and white or grayscale?
I hesitate to use terms like best, but if you were concerned about the size of your files, you could try it as black and white and look at the result. If it's good enough for you, then that's best. You know, if it's not, then I would try grayscale, and if that's good enough, then that's best. If it's not, maybe color would give you some improvement.
Well, that was the other question. If you had something that was black and white, but it was faded and old or whatever, even scanning it as color might improve it?
Yeah, and because you've got a little more to work with there to try to correct the color balance after you've done it.
Oh.
You have a little more information to work with. So, you know, because then you can go back in and you can start playing with, simplistically, you know, like I've done this with old newspaper clippings that I've really yellowed out over time. And I've gone back and said, okay, no, that's not yellow. That's actually, pretend it's white. And black is still black, and it's really popped up the thing, kind of like a fresh newspaper clipping. So you can start doing those kinds of games with it if you have, you know, all the color stuff scanned with it.
Oh, okay. All right.
Definitely can't do that with black and white.
No.
Might be able to play with it with grayscale, but, you know, I mean, best is just what works best for the image you have and the intended purpose. That's the frustrating thing about digital is that it's pretty nebulous. Yes?
Commenting a little bit on the camera versus the scanner. I've been doing a lot of scanning. The other day, as usual, I ended up with a piece of fragile paper that was about 10 by 12 and wouldn't fit on the scanner. So I got my best digital camera out because I know the more pixels are the better. And if I was lucky, if I could get probably 3/4 of what the bath says, of trying to get it framed and
Yeah.
without cutting a corner off. And I've noticed also, I guess it's the lens, I was shooting a little bit close, a little bit blurry at the edges, and, you know, you get into the optical problems. The scanner is a wonderful invention.
Yes.
It just isn't quite big enough for
Yeah.
some of the things I've got.
Yeah, I mean, if the document's not, you know, too fragile, I mean, the scanner has all the advantages. It has the exact kind of light source that it wants. There's no images or no issues with focusing, and so yeah, if you can use a scanner, that's probably going to give you the best results. Sometimes you have to live with the camera.
And hold on to that document, because when we ever get this book scanner here, you'll be able to scan that flat.
Some happy day, yeah.
I built a kind of a rig with some cheap lights, and by the way, you can find a compact fluorescents that are, what, 9,000 K or something, the real bright white,
Oh.
which helps. I'm always having the white balance problems with
Yeah.
the wet, because I don't know how it works in the computer.
And I'm still waiting for some information. A guy I saw at Ritztech, he had designed this, it's a real low-cost little light box that you can just
Yes.
lay your camera on top, and it has its own built-in light sources and stuff, and it looked really good, and it looks like it's going to be pretty low cost.
It actually has a place on the top to put your camera, set it on there, so you now don't have to have a camera stand.
Yeah,
But it's only going to be around, what, $100?
yeah, that's what he was
It
saying.
folds up,
Well, I use a tripod for the camera, but I also clamp about a
May I have your attention, please?
15-pound
The
clamp
library
on
will
one
close
leg,
in
so I can
30
tip
Yeah,
it with
that's,
my-
I've done that too.
This has actually got a hole in the top,
Library
and
materials
you
must
put
be
your
checked
camera
out
down there.
and
it
computer
becomes-
printouts paid for
it's
by 7:45 p.m.
But that's
The
going to
restrooms
be,
will close
I'm
promptly
waiting to,
at 8 p.m.
they had a beta, I guess, version of it.
Yeah, and they said, you know, if you signed up, they'd let you know when they're going to have the production
Right.
version out too. I haven't heard yet.
Yeah, but the nice thing is you can fold it up and take it with you to
Yeah.
your cousin's house.
How about the back row there? Any questions back there? We're done. Thank you all very much for coming. I do appreciate it. We'll see you one more time this year. Next month, we'll be talking about digital afterlife, what to do with all this stuff. This has been a presentation of the Dallas Genealogical Society. If you're already a member, thank you. Your membership dues are supporting this and other society activities. If you're not yet a member, I hope you consider joining. You can become a member for as little as $35 a year, and you can join by going to our website, dallasgenealogy.org, and clicking on the membership tab.